The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as a young royal guard took his position at his post. Standing tall and proud, his polished boots gleamed against the ancient cobblestones, and his perfectly pressed uniform spoke of hours of meticulous preparation. The iconic bearskin cap sat perfectly balanced on his head, adding to his already impressive height. This wasn't just any ordinary day at the palace. Tourist season was in full swing, and crowds had started gathering early, their excited chatter and camera clicks filling the air. The guard had earned his place here through years of dedicated service in the British Army. From training in the muddy fields of Catterick to serving in challenging missions overseas, every experience had shaped him into the soldier he was today. He remembered his grandfather's proud smile when he first told his family about being selected for the King's Guard. "You're making history," his grandfather had said, tears welling up in his eyes. Being one of the few soldiers of color in this prestigious position meant something special, not just to his family, but to countless young people who'd see him standing guard. As he stood motionless at his post, his mind wandered to his morning routine. He'd woken up at 4 a.m., spent an hour pressing his uniform until every crease was razor sharp, and another hour polishing his boots until they mirrored his face. His fellow guards often joked that you could use his boots as emergency mirrors during inspection. The tourists were becoming more numerous now. A group of schoolchildren pressed their faces against the railings, pointing and whispering. An elderly couple took photos from a respectful distance, while a tour guide explained the history of the King's Guard to her attentive group. He could hear snippets of their conversation about the Guard's training, though some of their facts were amusingly incorrect. No, they weren't required to stand still for 24 hours straight, and yes, they were allowed to blink. He'd learned to tune out most distractions during his duties, but he always kept a watchful eye on his surroundings. That was the thing most tourists didn't understand. While the guards appeared ceremonial, they were highly trained soldiers with real responsibilities. Their job wasn't just to be photographed. They were there to protect one of Britain's most important institutions. A small smile tried to tug at his lips as he remembered his first day on duty. He'd been so nervous about maintaining the famous stoic expression that his face had actually started cramping. Now, after countless shifts, it felt as natural as breathing. He'd seen it all: tourists making faces, telling jokes, even dancing around trying to make him laugh. Each attempt just made him more determined to maintain his professional composure. The morning wore on, and the guard continued his vigilant watch. Every 20 minutes he performed the ceremonial march, his movements precise and measured. Each step, each turn, each movement of his rifle was executed with perfect precision, the result of hundreds of hours of practice. The watching crowds always fell silent during these ceremonies, captivated by the display of military discipline. In between his ceremonial duties, he observed the changing patterns of the crowds. There were the early morning photographers trying to catch the perfect shot in the golden light. Then came the tour groups, followed by families with excited children. Each group brought its own energy to the palace grounds, and he'd learned to read the mood of the crowds like a weatherman reads clouds. What most people didn't realize was how much strength it took to stand so still for so long. His training had taught him to make subtle muscle movements to maintain circulation without visibly moving. It was like a secret dance that happened beneath the surface of absolute stillness. The weight of the bearskin cap, the rifle, and the full ceremonial uniform was considerable, but years of training had built up his endurance. As the morning crowd grew larger, he noticed a particular group of tourists gathering near his post. Something about their energy felt different from the usual excited visitors. Little did he know that this group would turn an ordinary morning into one that would be remembered for years to come. The air seemed to grow heavier with tension, like the calm before a storm, but he maintained his post with unwavering dedication, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The summer afternoon had brought a fresh wave of tourists to Buckingham Palace, their excited chatter mixing with the gentle rustling of leaves in the royal gardens. The guard remained at his post, his concentration unwavering despite the growing heat beneath his bearskin cap. Through years of training, he'd learned to read the crowd's energy without moving a muscle, and something about today's atmosphere felt different. Among the sea of friendly faces and clicking cameras, one particular tourist stood out. A middle-aged man wearing an expensive camera around his neck and designer sunglasses pushed his way through the crowd, his voice carrying louder than necessary. At first, the guard thought nothing of it. He'd seen all types of tourists during his time at the palace. The man was talking to his companions, but his voice seemed deliberately projected, meant for others to hear. "This place isn't what it used to be," he announced, gesturing broadly at the palace grounds. "Everything's changing too fast." A few nearby tourists shifted uncomfortably, parents quietly guiding their children away from his vicinity. Through his peripheral vision, the guard noticed a young couple from the crowd exchange worried glances. The woman whispered something to her partner, and they moved away, creating a small gap around the loud tourist. It was like watching ripples spread across a pond. Wherever the man moved, people naturally drifted away, leaving an empty space around him. The tourist continued his commentary, each statement more pointed than the last. He'd pause occasionally to take photos, but his real interest seemed to lie in drawing attention to himself. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip were quickly ushered away by their alert teachers, who'd picked up on the growing tension in the air. Two elderly women who'd been peacefully enjoying the palace view gathered their belongings and slowly walked away, shaking their heads in disapproval. The guard could hear one of them muttering, "Things were never like this in the old days." But she wasn't referring to the changes the tourist was complaining about, she was talking about his behavior. The palace security team, ever vigilant, had already noticed the disruption. Through subtle hand signals and radio communications, they began positioning themselves strategically around the area. To casual observers, it might have looked like routine movement, but the guard recognized their careful maneuvering. A young mother trying to navigate the crowd with a stroller made a wide berth around the agitated tourist, her instincts telling her to keep her distance. The baby in the stroller was happily waving at the guard, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. The guard maintained his stoic expression, but his training had him mentally noting every detail of the unfolding situation. The tourist's companion seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior. One tried to suggest moving to a different viewing spot, while another made a show of checking the time and mentioning other attractions they needed to visit. But the man wasn't interested in their subtle hints. Instead, he began filming with his phone, his commentary becoming more confrontational with each passing minute. Other visitors continued their palace experience as best they could, though the joyful atmosphere had noticeably dimmed. A street performer who'd been entertaining children nearby packed up his props earlier than usual, sensing that this wasn't the right time for his act. The usual happy snapshots and selfies became more hurried, as if people were trying to capture their memories quickly before moving along. The guard's extensive military training had taught him to recognize warning signs, and every instinct told him this situation was escalating. Yet he remained perfectly still, his face impassive, his posture exemplary. Years of discipline allowed him to maintain absolute composure while staying mentally prepared for any scenario. A palace tour guide expertly diverted her group to a different area, seamlessly incorporating the move into her historical commentary about the palace grounds. It was a subtle demonstration of how the entire palace staff, from guards to tour guides, were trained to handle delicate situations without creating alarm. As the afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the palace grounds, the tension continued to build. The tourist's behavior was like a stone thrown into a calm pond, creating ripples that affected everyone around him. Yet through it all, the guard remained a picture of professional dignity, representing centuries of royal tradition and military excellence. Little did anyone know that this situation was about to take a turn that would test every aspect of his training and character. The afternoon heat had reached its peak, and the crowd around Buckingham Palace had thinned slightly as tourists sought shade under the ancient oak trees. The guard remained at his post, his ceremonial rifle held perfectly still, when the confrontation he'd been anticipating finally began. The agitated tourist, who had been circling closer and closer like a moth drawn to flame, finally crossed the invisible line. He walked right up to the barrier, phone held high, its camera lens pointed directly at the guard's face. "Hen Yu," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Several nearby tourists lowered their cameras, the cheerful atmosphere evaporating like morning dew. A young couple who had been taking selfies quickly pocketed their phones, their expressions shifting from joy to concern. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, exactly as his training demanded. I said, "Look at me." The tourist demanded again, his voice growing louder. "You're not what I came all this way to see. This isn't the real Britain I read about in my history books." His words carried ugly implications that made other visitors visibly cringe. A father quickly covered his young daughter's ears and hurried her away from the scene. Through it all, the guard maintained his composure, though beneath his stoic exterior, his mind was racing through protocol procedures. His peripheral vision caught the subtle movements of palace security personnel shifting positions, ready to intervene if necessary. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this, but the reality was still challenging. An elderly British woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Young man, that's quite enough. You're embarrassing yourself and your country." Several others nodded in agreement, but the tourist ignored them, his attention fixed solely on the guard. The tourist's companions tried to pull him away, clearly mortified by his behavior. "Come on," one whispered urgently, "let's go see the changing of the guard instead." But their words fell on deaf ears as the man shrugged them off, his face reddening with each passing moment. Phones had started recording the scene, but not for the usual tourist memories. People sensed something significant was unfolding, though none could have predicted exactly what would happen next. The atmosphere had become so tense you could hear the rustle of leaves in the palace gardens. The tourist began a tirade about traditional values and the way things used to be, each word more inappropriate than the last. A group of international students who had been enjoying their first visit to the palace huddled together, their excited chatter replaced by concerned whispers. Their tour guide tried to distract them with historical facts about the palace architecture, but no one was listening anymore. Two American tourists, both wearing matching London-themed T-shirts, stepped forward as if to intervene, but palace security supply waved them back. This was a delicate situation that needed to be handled by trained professionals. The guard noticed all of this without moving a muscle, his training allowing him to stay aware of his surroundings while maintaining perfect composure. The tourist's voice grew louder, his words more aggressive. He began making wild claims about the guard's right to wear the uniform, each statement more offensive than the last. A nearby street vendor selling ice cream quietly closed his cart and wheeled it away, wanting no part of the unfolding scene. Other visitors had formed a loose circle around the area, many recording with their phones, though most looked uncomfortable doing so. A mother comforted her crying child, who couldn't understand why the nice man in the fancy uniform was being yelled at. The guard wanted to reassure the child that everything was fine, but his duty required absolute stillness. Palace pigeons, usually unflappable in the face of tourist crowds, took flight as the tourist's voice reached new levels of aggression. The bird's sudden movement caught the attention of several visitors, who took it as a sign to step back further, creating more space around the confrontation. The guard's training had prepared him for various scenarios, but the personal nature of this attack tested his resolve like never before. Still, he stood proud, his posture perfect, his discipline unwavering. In his mind, he wasn't just defending his own honor, he was representing centuries of military tradition and the changing face of modern Britain. The tension in the air had reached a breaking point. Everyone could sense that something had to give, but no one could have predicted what happened next. The tourist, frustrated by the guard's continued professional composure, was about to cross a line that would turn this uncomfortable scene into an incident that would be remembered for years to come. The tension around Buckingham Palace had reached its peak. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard as tourists watched the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and disbelief. The guard stood firm at his post, exactly as he had been trained, though every instinct told him that something was about to happen. The tourist, red-faced and increasingly agitated, had worked himself into a state of complete frustration. His phone was still held high, recording everything, while his other hand gestured wildly as he continued his inappropriate remarks. His own friends had backed away entirely, shame evident on their faces as they watched their companion's behavior spiral out of control. "If you won't respond to me," the tourist shouted, his voice cracking with anger, "maybe you'll respond to this." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. The tourist suddenly lunged forward, his hand reaching out toward the guard's bearskin cap. the sacred symbol of the King's Guard that represented centuries of military tradition. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several people screamed warnings, but it was too late. The tourists' fingers made contact with the ceremonial uniform, violating not just personal space, but centuries of military protocol. The sound of his hand hitting the uniform echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. A young boy who had been eating an ice cream cone dropped it in shock, the treat forgotten as it melted on the cobblestones. An elderly veteran in the crowd stood up from his bench, his face a mask of outrage at this blatant disrespect to a serving member of the military. The tourists' companions finally sprang into action, calling out to their friend to stop, but their words came too late. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, broken a rule that couldn't be broken. The guard's ceremonial rifle shifted slightly, the first movement he'd made in hours, and it spoke volumes. Several phones captured the moment in high definition, their owners hardly daring to breathe as they recorded. A tour guide who had seen countless incidents during her years at the palace later said she'd never witnessed anything quite like this. The tourist, perhaps realizing too late the gravity of his actions, took a stumbling step backward, but his hand had already made contact. Palace security was moving in swiftly now, their practiced formations closing around the scene like a well-oiled machine. But they were still seconds away, and protocol dictated that the guard himself was the first line of defense against any physical threat. The tourist's phone continued recording, though his hand now trembled as he held it. His face showed the first flickers of uncertainty, perhaps finally understanding that the guard's stoic demeanor wasn't just for show. These were highly trained military personnel with very real authority. A mother shielded her children's eyes, not wanting them to witness what might happen next. An American tourist who had served in the military himself shook his head sadly, knowing exactly how serious this breach of protocol was. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and dread. The guard's training had prepared him for this exact scenario, though he had hoped never to use it. Each member of the King's Guard carried not just the weight of their ceremonial uniform, but the responsibility of protecting one of Britain's most important institutions. Now, that training was about to be put to the test. The tourist stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. The crowd had gone completely silent, the usual tourist chatter replaced by the heavy weight of anticipation. Even the palace pigeons seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their usual cooing silenced. Security cameras swiveled to focus on the scene, their red lights blinking steadily as they recorded every detail. The palace staff who monitored these feeds would later describe this as one of the most serious breaches they'd witnessed in years. The next few seconds would determine how this incident would be remembered in palace history. The guard's response needed to be measured yet firm, professional yet decisive. As he prepared to act, he remembered his training officer's words. "Your uniform represents not just yourself, but the entire British military and the crown itself." The tourist was about to learn that beneath the ceremonial uniform and traditional display, every member of the King's Guard was a highly trained soldier ready to act when necessary. The next moment would change both their lives forever, becoming a powerful reminder of the real authority behind the ceremonial facade. In the split second after the tourist made contact with the guard's uniform, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace changed completely. What happened next was a masterclass in military precision and professional restraint, executed with the kind of discipline that comes from years of intense training. The guard's first movement in hours was a ceremonial stamp of his boot against the cobblestones, the traditional warning that every King's Guard is trained to give before taking action. The sharp sound echoed across the courtyard like a thunderclap, causing several tourists to jump in surprise. This wasn't just for show, it was a required warning, giving the tourist one final chance to back away. When the tourist failed to retreat, the guard smoothly transitioned into the next phase of his security protocol. In one fluid motion, he brought his ceremonial rifle to the port arms position, a defensive stance that every military person in the crowd immediately recognized. The movement was precise, controlled, and by-the-book perfect. "Step back from the barrier immediately," the guard commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. It was the first time many in the crowd had heard a King's Guard speak while on duty, and the power of his professional tone made several people straighten their own posture instinctively. The tourist, suddenly faced with the reality that the ceremonial guard was very much a real soldier, stumbled backward. His phone, which had been recording everything, slipped from his trembling fingers but was caught by the strap around his wrist. His face had lost all its previous arrogance, replaced by the dawning realization of the severity of his actions. Palace security was converging on the scene now, their movements swift and coordinated. But the guard didn't need their assistance to handle the situation. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of incident, and his response was textbook perfect. When the tourist made one last misguided attempt to reach for the uniform, the guard executed a defensive maneuver that left everyone watching in awe. Without any wasted motion or excessive force, he secured his rifle according to protocol and smoothly restrained the tourist using approved military techniques. The movement was so precise it could have been used as a training video. A retired military officer in the crowd nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the guard's perfect execution of protocol. "That's how it's done," he commented to those around him. "Minimum force, maximum control." Several people nearby murmured in agreement, relieved to see the situation being handled so professionally. The tourist, now properly restrained, had lost all his previous bravado. His face showed a mix of shock and embarrassment as he realized his actions had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The guard held him firmly but carefully, using exactly the amount of force necessary, no more, no less. Palace security arrived seconds later, seamlessly taking control of the situation. The guard smoothly handed the tourist over to them, his movements never losing their military precision. Then, in a display of remarkable professionalism, he immediately resumed his guard position, adjusting his bearskin cap with one practiced motion. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, finally exhaled. Several people broke into spontaneous applause, impressed by the guard's perfect handling of the situation. A young child tapped on his mother's sleeve, whispering loudly, "See, Mum. I told you they were real soldiers." The tourists' friends, who had been watching in horror, were now speaking quietly with palace security, providing their information for the official report. Their faces showed a mix of embarrassment and relief that the situation hadn't escalated further, thanks to the guard's professional response. As police arrived to take statements from witnesses, phones throughout the crowd were already uploading videos of the incident. The guard's textbook response would soon become a viral example of professional restraint and proper military procedure in the face of provocation. Throughout it all, the guard maintained perfect military bearing. After ensuring the situation was fully under control, he resumed his ceremonial duties as if nothing had happened. This seamless return to duty impressed the crowd even more than his handling of the incident. It showed that this level of professional excellence was simply business as usual for the King's Guard. The afternoon sun continued its arc across the sky, and regular palace activities resumed. But something had changed in how the crowd viewed the guard. They now saw beyond the ceremonial uniform to the highly trained soldier beneath. The incident had served as a powerful reminder that while the King's Guard may be a tourist attraction, they were first and foremost elite military personnel, ready to act with precision and professionalism when duty called. Within minutes of the incident, Buckingham Palace had transformed into a hub of focused activity. Police officers moved efficiently through the crowd, collecting statements from witnesses who were eager to share what they'd seen. The tourist's own phone footage, which he'd been so keen to record, would now become evidence against him. "I got it all on video," said a French tourist, holding up her phone. The guard was completely professional. He did everything by the book. Others nodded in agreement, many offering their own recordings to the police. In the age of smartphones, the incident had been captured from almost every angle, leaving no room for doubt about what had transpired. The tourist, now seated in a police vehicle, looked nothing like the aggressive man from moments before. His face had lost all color, and he kept shaking his head, as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. His friends spoke quietly with police officers, explaining how their London vacation had taken such an unexpected turn. Meanwhile, social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident. One clip showing the guard's perfectly executed response had gone viral within minutes. Comments poured in from around the world, many from military veterans praising the guard's textbook handling of the situation. A small crowd had gathered near the palace gift shop, where an elderly man who'd served in the military years ago was explaining to curious tourists about the training King's Guards receive. "People think they're just there for show," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Today proved what we veterans have always known. They're elite soldiers first and foremost." Inside the palace, senior military officials were reviewing the security footage. They would later report that the guard's response had been exemplary in every way. Every movement, from his warning stamp to the final restraint, had followed protocol perfectly. It would later be used as a training example for future guards. The palace's public relations team was already fielding calls from news organizations around the world. The incident had struck a chord with people everywhere, perhaps because it challenged common misconceptions about the guards being purely ceremonial. The story was quickly becoming about more than just one tourist's poor behavior. It was highlighting the professionalism of Britain's military traditions. Tourists who had witnessed the incident were sharing their experiences with newcomers who arrived later in the day. "You should have seen it," one American tourist told his group. "It was like watching years of training come together in a few seconds. No excess force, no drama, just pure professionalism." The guard himself remained at his post, continuing his duties with the same dedication as before. If anything, his bearing seemed even more precise, his movements more crisp. Other tourists now watched him with newfound respect, understanding that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a highly trained soldier. Palace staff had to rearrange several tour groups as police continued their investigation. Yet somehow the usual flow of palace activities continued. It was a testament to the staff's professionalism that they could handle such an incident while maintaining the dignity of the royal residence. Various videos of the incident were being shared across social platforms, each gaining thousands of views by the minute. What caught many people's attention wasn't just the confrontation, but the guard's return to duty immediately afterward. That simple act of resuming his post spoke volumes about military discipline. A group of schoolchildren who had witnessed everything were now asking their teacher thoughtful questions about the role of the King's Guard. Their curiosity had shifted from the ceremonial aspects to a genuine interest in the Guard's training and responsibilities. It was turning into an unexpected but valuable learning moment. Back at the police van, officers were carefully documenting everything. They had handled similar incidents before, but this one was different. It had been captured so clearly and had demonstrated the perfect response to provocation. One officer mentioned that this would likely become a reference case for future incidents. As the afternoon wore on, palace visitors continued to snap photos of the guard, but with a noticeably different attitude. Gone were the silly poses and attempts to make him smile. Instead, people maintained a respectful distance, many offering small nods of appreciation as they took their pictures. The incident had unintentionally pulled back the curtain on what it truly meant to be a member of the King's Guard. It showed that behind the traditional ceremony and tourist attraction lay a corps of highly trained military professionals, ready to act when necessary while maintaining the dignity of their position. The court hearing took place 2 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace. The tourist, now wearing a somber suit instead of his vacation clothes, stood before the judge looking like a completely different person. The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public, all eager to hear the outcome of a case that had captured international attention. As the prosecution presented their evidence, the videos from that day played on the courtroom screens. The tourist could barely watch himself, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. His behavior, which had seemed so bold at the palace, now looked small and shameful in the formal setting of the court. What we witnessed that day, the prosecutor explained, wasn't just an attack on one guard, but an assault on the principles and traditions that the King's Guard represents. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of witness statements, countless video recordings, and the tourist's own phone footage painted a clear picture of what had happened. The judge, a distinguished older woman with decades of experience, listened carefully to all the evidence. When it was time to deliver her verdict, she removed her glasses and addressed the courtroom directly. "In my years on the bench," she began, I've seen many cases of poor judgment, but this display of disrespect to a serving member of our military stands out. The tourist's lawyer presented his client's remorse, explaining how the man had already lost his job back home due to the viral videos. Several character witnesses spoke about how this behavior was completely out of character, describing him as someone who had simply lost control in a moment of frustration. During the proceedings, it came to light that this wasn't the tourist's first incident of this kind. Records showed similar, though less serious, confrontations at other historical sites in different countries. This pattern of behavior significantly influenced the judge's decision. When it came time for sentencing, the judge was clear and firm. She imposed a substantial fine and a suspended jail sentence, with the requirement that the tourist attend cultural sensitivity training. This sentence, she explained, reflects not just the assault itself, but the prejudiced motivation behind it. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the incident had sparked positive changes. Tour guides now included information about the King's Guard's military training in their presentations, helping visitors understand that these weren't just ceremonial figures, but highly trained soldiers. The guard himself had received commendations from his superiors for his perfect handling of the situation. In military circles, the incident was being used as a training example of how to respond to provocations while maintaining professional composure. Young recruits would study this case for years to come. Educational programs at the palace have been updated to include more information about the modern face of Britain's military. School groups now learned about the diverse background of service members who protected the royal residences, helping to break down outdated stereotypes. Social media continued to play a role in the story's impact. The videos had sparked meaningful discussions about respect, tradition, and the changing face of modern Britain. Military veterans from around the world shared their own experiences, creating a global conversation about professionalism in the face of prejudice. The incident had an unexpected effect on palace tourism. Visitors now showed more respect for the guards, maintaining proper distances and showing genuine interest in their training and duties. Parents could be heard explaining to their children that these were real soldiers deserving of respect, not just tourist attractions. In police training programs, the incident became a case study in how to handle provocative situations. The guards' measured response, giving a warning, following protocol, and using minimal force, was highlighted as an example of perfect professional conduct under pressure. The story found its way into military training manuals worldwide. The guards' response was praised for demonstrating how traditional ceremonial roles could adapt to modern challenges while maintaining their historical dignity. It showed that centuries-old protocols were still relevant and effective in today's world. As weeks turned into months, the incident left a lasting legacy. It had turned an ugly moment into a powerful lesson about respect, professionalism, and the evolving face of traditional institutions. What could have been just another viral video had become a watershed moment in how people viewed the King's Guard. The final word came from a senior military official during a press conference. This incident reminded everyone that behind every ceremonial uniform stands a highly trained soldier ready to perform their duty with excellence. It showed that tradition and progress can stand together, making our institutions stronger while preserving their historic dignity.